August 3rd, 1945, Camp Butner, North Carolina. The heat pressed down like a wool blanket soaked in summer rain. Cicadas scream from the pine trees beyond the wire, their song relentless, maddening in its constancy. Inside Barrack 7, 42 German women sat on wooden benches, hands folded in their laps, eyes fixed on the American officer standing before them. Major Eleanor Walsh held a clipboard against her pressed uniform, her face unreadable in the shaft of afternoon light cutting through the window. When she spoke, her voice carried the careful neutrality of someone delivering news that would shatter worlds. Ladies, the war is over. Germany has surrendered. You will be repatriated within 60 days. The words hung in the humid air like smoke. Some women nodded slowly, mechanically, as though their bodies remembered how to respond even when their minds could not process the information. Others stared at nothing, their faces blank as washed stone. But in the back row, a woman named Margaret Hoffman, 28 years old, former communications specialist from Stuttgart, felt her stomach drop as though she'd stepped off a cliff she hadn't seen coming. Go home. The phrase should have sparked joy, relief, the desperate longing that had sustained them through the Atlantic crossing, through the bewildering first days of captivity, through the slow erosion of everything they'd been taught to believe. But Margaret's hands trembled in her lap. Home was rubble. Home was hunger. Home was a father dead in Stalingrad, a mother crushed under the remains of their apartment building, a younger sister vanished into the chaos of the Eastern Front's collapse. Home was a word that had lost its meaning somewhere between the propaganda broadcasts and the mornings she'd watched American bombers turn Stuttgart into an inferno. Major Walsh continued reading from her clipboard, her tone professional, almost gentle. Transportation will be arranged. You will receive medical clearances, travel documents, and a small stipend. The Red Cross will assist with family reunification efforts. Any questions should be directed to. A hand shot up. Ilse Becker, 34 years old, a nurse who'd served in field hospitals from France to Poland, her voice steady but her eyes betraying something close to panic. Major Walsh, is there any possibility of delay? Some of us have no family left, no homes to return to. Walsh's expression softened, just barely, the professional mask cracking for a heartbeat before snapping back into place. I understand your concerns, Miss Becker. However, the Geneva Convention requires repatriation of all prisoners of war upon cessation of hostilities. The United States cannot indefinitely hold. We're not asking to be held. The voice came from the middle of the room, quiet but clear. Margaret surprised herself by speaking. Every eye turned toward her. We're asking to stay. Silence. Even the cicadas seemed to pause. Major Walsh blinked. Once, twice, as though the words had been spoken in a language she didn't recognize. In the rows of benches, some women straightened, their faces shifting from resignation to something that looked dangerously like hope. Others looked away, uncomfortable with the nakedness of the confession. Walsh cleared her throat. Miss Hoffman, I believe you're confused about the process. You're not being given a choice. Repatriation is mandatory. Then we're asking you to make it optional. Margaret stood, her legs unsteady but her voice growing stronger. For those of us who have nothing to return to, for those of us who... She paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound like treason to her own past. For those of us who found something here we didn't know existed. The major's jaw tightened. She glanced at the MP standing guard by the door, a young corporal whose face had gone carefully blank. This conversation is inappropriate. The decision has been made at the highest levels of command. You will be going home. But as Walsh turned to leave, her polished shoes clicking against the wooden floorboards, Margaret called out one more time. What if home doesn't exist anymore? The major paused at the door. For a long moment, she didn't turn around. When she finally did, her expression was no longer neutral. It was troubled, conflicted, almost sad. Then I suggest you build a new one. In Germany. The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like a cell locking. Margaret sat back down. Around her, the women remained silent, but something had shifted in the air of the barrack. A thought, once unthinkable, had been spoken aloud. A crack had appeared in the facade of obedience they'd maintained since capture. And through that crack, a dangerous possibility was seeping in. They didn't want to go home. And in the weeks to come, they would discover they weren't alone in that heretical desire. The story of how German female prisoners of war came to beg their captors for the right to remain in America is not one you'll find in most history books. It's a tale buried in dusty military archives, in letters never sent, in memories too complicated to share with a shattered nation, desperate for simple narratives of suffering and survival. It's a story of women who crossed an ocean expecting cruelty and found something far more confusing: order, abundance, and a peculiar American mercy that didn't ask for gratitude, only obedience to rules that treated enemies as human beings. What happened at Camp Butner that summer was only the beginning. Across 23 states, in camps scattered from Georgia to Wisconsin, from Texas to Massachusetts, similar scenes would unfold. German women, once auxiliaries in the Wehrmacht machine, radio operators and nurses and clerks who'd worn the gray uniform and believed the promises of the Thousand-Year Reich, now faced a choice that tore them apart from within. Return to a homeland that existed only in ruins and memory, or beg for a chance to remain in the land of the enemy they'd been taught to hate. This is the story of that impossible choice, of women caught between two worlds, neither of which wanted them, of the smell of bacon and fresh bread that haunted their dreams, of soap and clean water and the terrible weight of being treated with dignity when you'd expected brutality, of letters written and hidden, pleading not for freedom, but for the right to stay in captivity a little longer, of the American officers who didn't know what to do with prisoners who refused to go home, and of the question that would haunt both captors and captives long after the last camp gate swung shut. What happens when the enemy shows you more humanity than your own nation ever did? And if you choose kindness over country, what does that make you? The answer, like everything else about this story, was far more complicated than anyone wanted to admit. September 1943, the Atlantic crossing. The ship pitched and rolled, its steel hull groaning against waves that seemed determined to shake every rivet loose. In the holds below deck, Margaret Hoffman clutched a bucket and tried not to vomit for the third time in as many hours. Around her, dozens of other women lay in hammocks, strung between pipes, their faces green in the dim emergency lighting. The air reeked of diesel fuel, sweat, and the sour tang of seasickness. They'd been at sea for 9 days. 9 days since the British had marched them onto the transport in Southampton, their capture still fresh enough to feel surreal. 9 days since Margaret had last seen European soil, the coast of England disappearing into fog like a memory already starting to fade. 9 days of uncertainty, fear, and the constant low-grade terror of not knowing what waited on the other side of the ocean. The propaganda had been clear, relentless, burned into their minds through years of radio broadcasts and whispered warnings. Americans were savages, degenerates, a mongrel nation of gangsters and Jews, their culture rotted by capitalism and individualism, their soldiers brutal and undisciplined. If captured, expect humiliation, expect violation, expect to be used and discarded like tools that had outlived their purpose. Margaret had half believed it and half dismissed it as the usual exaggerations meant to keep soldiers fighting past the point of reason. But now, strapped into a hammock in the belly of an American ship, the unknown looming closer with every nautical mile, the old fears returned with new urgency. Beside her, Ilse Becker leaned over to whisper, her voice barely audible above the engine's rumble. "Do you think they'll separate us? Send us to different camps?" "I don't know." Margaret's throat was raw. "I don't know anything anymore. They've been feeding us." Ilse's tone carried a note of bewilderment. "Real food, coffee, bread without sawdust." It was true. Twice a day, American sailors brought trays down to the holds, metal, containers filled with stew, potatoes, even canned fruit. The portions were generous, almost obscenely so compared to the rations they'd known in Germany. Some women refused to eat at first, convinced the food was poisoned or drugged. But hunger eroded suspicion, and within days everyone ate. The taste of real meat, of white bread, of coffee that didn't taste like burned grain was impossible to resist. Margaret had written about it in the small notebook she'd managed to keep hidden from inspection. "They feed us better than our own army fed us in the field," she'd scrawled in cramped handwriting. "I don't understand what this means." Above deck, the world was a churning wilderness of gray water and grayer sky. Gulls followed the ship, their cries sharp and mocking. When the women were allowed up for air in small groups, heavily guarded, they stood at the rails and stared at the horizon, searching for land that never appeared. The ocean was bigger than Margaret had imagined, emptier, more indifferent. It swallowed distance and time, reducing everything to the endless rhythm of waves and wind. An American sailor, barely 20 years old with freckles scattered across his sunburned nose, tried once to speak to her in broken German. "We Gates?" he'd asked, mangling the pronunciation so badly she almost smiled despite herself. When she didn't answer, he'd shrugged and offered her a cigarette. She'd taken it, her hands trembling, and he'd lit it for her with a battered Zippo before walking away. No leering, no insults. Just a brief, mundane gesture of the sort that didn't fit any of the narratives she'd been taught. The other women noticed too. In the quiet conversations that stretched through the long nights below deck, they compared observations, trying to make sense of the contradictions. The guards were young, often bored, sometimes friendly in an awkward, uncertain way. They didn't shout unless giving orders. They didn't strike. They looked at the prisoners with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort, as though unsure how to reconcile the enemy with the tired, seasick women before them. "Maybe it's different once we land," someone muttered. "Maybe this is just for the crossing." But doubt had begun to seep in, cold and persistent as the Atlantic spray. On the 10th day, the cry went up from the deck. "Land ho!" The women crowded the portholes, pressing against the glass to catch a glimpse. Through the salt-crusted windows, a dark smudge appeared on the horizon, gradually resolving into the outline of a coast. America. The word itself felt strange in Margaret's mouth, heavy with implications she couldn't yet name. As the ship maneuvered into port, the women were ordered to gather their belongings. Margaret had little enough: a change of clothes, the hidden notebook, a photograph of her family taken before the war. Everyone smiling in front of a house that no longer existed. She tucked the photo into her breast pocket, close to her heart, and joined the line shuffling toward the stairs. The port was chaos contained by American efficiency. Cranes swung overhead, loading and unloading cargo with mechanical precision. Soldiers moved in organized streams, their uniforms crisp despite the heat. And beyond the docks, rising like a vision from another world, the city itself. Buildings taller than any Margaret had seen in Stuttgart, their windows catching the afternoon sun and throwing it back in blinding sheets of light. Cars moved along distant streets, countless cars, more than she'd imagined existed in the entire world. The air smelled of salt and diesel and something else, something she couldn't identify at first. It took her several minutes to realize the smell of industry uninterrupted by war. They were marched down the gangway in single file, boots echoing on metal. At the bottom, American officials waited with clipboards, checking names against lists, sorting prisoners into groups. Margaret watched women ahead of her being assigned to trucks, and then it was her turn. Name? Hoffman, Margaret Hoffman. The officer, a woman in her 40s with steel gray hair and sharp eyes, made a mark on her clipboard. Service branch? Luftwaffe Auxiliaries, Communications. Another mark. Age? 28. The officer looked up, studying Margaret's face as though searching for something specific. Then she nodded and gestured toward a waiting truck. Group C, move along. Margaret climbed into the truck bed, joining a dozen other women already seated on the benches. The canvas covering flapped in the breeze, offering glimpses of the passing city as they drove. And what she saw defied everything she'd been told. Shops with full windows, restaurants with people seated at outdoor tables, eating, laughing, children riding bicycles down clean sidewalks. Women in colorful dresses, their hair styled, their faces free of the gaunt desperation Margaret had grown accustomed to. No rubble, no bombed-out buildings, no signs of deprivation or suffering. Just prosperity, casual and abundant, as though war were something happening in another universe entirely. In the truck, the women were silent, each processing the same unbearable revelation. Germany was dying. America was thriving. The contrast wasn't subtle. It was a chasm so vast it made Margaret's chest ache with a feeling she couldn't name. Not quite anger, not quite envy. Something closer to grief for a world she'd believed in that was already gone. The truck drove for hours, leaving the city behind, passing through countryside that rolled green and endless under a sky free of bomber contrails. They stopped once for water and bathroom breaks at a rest station where American families gawked at them from a safe distance, pointing, whispering. Margaret avoided their eyes, focusing on the ground, on the grass that was greener than any grass she'd seen in years. When they finally arrived at the camp, twilight was falling. The gates opened to reveal rows of wooden barracks, guard towers, and neat paths lined with white stones. Floodlights clicked on, bathing everything in harsh white light. And as Margaret stepped down from the truck, her legs stiff from the journey, she caught a smell drifting from one of the buildings. Bacon. Frying bacon. Her stomach twisted. The propaganda had warned of starvation, of cruelty, of Americans who would starve their prisoners to death. But the smell was undeniable, rich and savory, the scent of meat cooking in abundance. An officer approached, megaphone in hand. His voice boomed across the yard. "Welcome to Camp Butner. You will be processed, assigned quarters, and given your first meal. Follow your group leaders. No talking." They filed into the processing building, a long structure with fluorescent lights humming overhead. Inside, more officers waited behind desks, more clipboards, more forms to fill out. Margaret's belongings were inventoried, her photograph logged and returned, her name entered into what seemed like an infinite number of ledgers. The bureaucracy was mind-numbing, impersonal, and somehow reassuring in its very ordinariness. Then came the showers. The word sent a ripple of fear through the group. Showers. Disinfection. The rumors from the camps in the east whispered horrors that no one quite believed, but everyone feared. Margaret's hands went cold. Around her, several women began to cry softly. But when they were led into the shower room, there were no gas valves, no sealed chambers, just tiled walls, shower heads, and benches stacked with towels and bars of soap. Real soap, white and clean, not the gray stuff that barely lathered. A female American officer, her tone brisk but not unkind, explained through a translator that they would shower, that their clothes would be laundered, that they would be issued clean uniforms. "You will not be harmed," the translator said, and something in the way she spoke, tired and matter-of-fact, made it almost believable. Margaret undressed with the others, her skin prickling with cold and residual fear. The water, when it came, was hot. Not lukewarm, not barely functional, hot. It poured over her shoulders, washing away weeks of grime, of salt, of the accumulation of travel and terror. The soap lathered rich and thick, smelling faintly of lavender. She scrubbed her skin until it hurt, until she felt something like clean again. And when she looked around, she saw other women crying, not from fear, but from something else. Relief, maybe, or the collapse of certainty. They were given cotton dresses, plain and marked with POWs stenciled across the back, but clean and intact. They were given underwear, socks, even simple canvas shoes. Margaret dressed slowly, feeling the fabric against her skin, and tried to reconcile this with the image of brutal captors she'd carried across the Atlantic. And then they were marched to the mess hall. The building was long and low, windows steamed from cooking. Inside, tables stretched in rows, and at the serving counter, American soldiers in aprons ladled food onto metal trays. The smell was overwhelming. Bacon, yes, but also potatoes, bread, coffee. Real coffee, black and strong, sending up curls of steam. Margaret moved through the line in a daze. A piece of fried bacon was placed on her tray. 2 scoops of mashed potatoes, a thick slice of white bread with a pat of butter, a cup of coffee. She found a seat and stared down at the food, her mind unable to process what her eyes were seeing. The woman across from her, Anna Schmidt, 31 years old, former telephone operator from Munich, whispered, "Is this real?" Margaret didn't answer. She picked up the bacon with trembling fingers, brought it to her mouth, and bit down. The taste exploded across her tongue. Salt, fat, the smoky richness of pork cooked to perfection. It was the taste of abundance, of a world where food wasn't rationed, where meals could be generous without apology. She chewed slowly, tears streaming down her face, and she wasn't sure if she was crying from relief or shame, or the terrible realization that everything she'd believed about the enemy was crumbling with every bite. Around her, the other women ate in silence, their faces reflecting the same confusion, the same impossible conflict. They had expected brutality. They had prepared themselves for the worst. Instead, they'd been given soap and hot water and bacon. And that, somehow, was more devastating than any cruelty could have been, because it meant the enemy was human. And if the enemy was human, then what did that make them? That first night in the barracks, lying on a straw mattress that was thin but clean, Margaret stared at the wooden ceiling and listened to the sound of women crying softly in the darkness. Outside, a guard walked past, his footsteps regular and unhurried. The floodlights cast angular shadows through the windows, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the faint sound of music, American music, drifting from the guard quarters. She pressed her hand against her stomach, still full from dinner, and thought about the letter she would eventually write, but could never send. "Dear Mother," she would say, if her mother were still alive to read it. "Dear Mother, the Americans fed me bacon today, and I don't know what that means. I don't know if I'm a prisoner or a guest. I don't know if I should hate them or thank them. I don't know anything anymore except that I'm alive, and I'm clean, and I'm full, and tomorrow they will feed me again, and that terrible, wonderful certainty that tomorrow there would be food, that there would be order, that there would be safety behind these fences and guards, was already beginning to feel like something she couldn't bear to lose, even if it meant betraying everything she'd once believed in, even if it meant choosing the enemy over home." October 1943. Camp Butner. The days settled into rhythm, and rhythm became routine, and routine became something dangerously close to comfort. Wake at 6 to the sound of a bell. Roll call in the yard, the women standing in neat rows while an American officer counted them with the efficiency of someone inventorying supplies. Breakfast in the mess hall, oatmeal, eggs, toast, coffee that was always hot and always plentiful. Work assignments after breakfast, different for each woman depending on skills and temperament. Margaret was assigned to the camp laundry, a long building filled with industrial washing machines that roared like mechanical beasts, steam rising from vats of hot water. She worked alongside 3 other German women and 2 American WACs, who supervised without supervising, their presence more symbolic than necessary. The work was monotonous, sorting uniforms, feeding them into machines, hanging them to dry on lines that stretched the length of the building. But it was work that didn't destroy, work that served a purpose beyond the machinery of war. The soap they used was industrial strength, harsh on the hands but effective. Margaret's fingers grew red and chapped, and one of the WACs, a woman named Dorothy from somewhere called Nebraska, brought her a jar of hand cream. "You gotta protect your skin," Dorothy said, her accent strange but her gesture simple. Margaret took the cream, muttered a thank you in broken English, and spent that evening rubbing it into her hands, confused by the kindness. By November, the camp library opened. It was a small building, once a storage shed, now lined with shelves donated by local churches and filled with books in both English and German. Margaret discovered it by accident one Sunday afternoon, wandering aimlessly, and stood in the doorway, staring at the spines. Novels, history, poetry, philosophy. Books she'd heard of but never read. Books that had been banned in Germany or simply unavailable due to shortages. She pulled a volume from the shelf at random, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn in German translation. She sat on a wooden chair by the window and began to read, and the voice of the boy on the raft carried her far from North Carolina. Far from the war, into a world where freedom was a river and conscience was something you wrestled with alone. When she looked up, 3 hours had passed. The light had changed, golden and slanting, through the pines. An American officer stood in the doorway, watching her. She started to stand, to apologize, but he waved her back down. "Enjoy the book," he said in careful German. "That's what it's there for." She stared at him, searching for the trap, the mockery, but his face was neutral, almost bored, the face of a man performing a duty he'd performed 100 times before. He left without another word, and Margaret sat back down, the book open in her lap, her mind spinning. They were being given books, not just rations and shelter, but books, as though their minds mattered, as though they were worth the investment of paper and ink and time. The propaganda had never prepared her for this. The camp had established a newspaper, the PW Post, written by prisoners under American supervision. It published announcements, schedules, even creative writing submissions. Margaret started reading it obsessively, analyzing every word for hidden meanings. In the back pages, she found letters to the editor, prisoners debating the nature of democracy, the future of Germany, the meaning of the war they'd lost. One letter caught her attention. It was signed by Ilsa Becker, the nurse from the Atlantic crossing. "We are being taught," Ilsa wrote, "not through lectures but through example. Order without brutality, abundance without apology, rules that apply equally to all. This is not the American chaos we were promised. This is something else entirely." Margaret cut out the letter and kept it folded in her notebook. By December, English classes had begun. The Americans brought in a teacher, a civilian woman from Raleigh named Mrs. Patterson, whose patience seemed inexhaustible. She taught them simple phrases first. "Good morning. Thank you. Where is the bathroom?" The women stumbled over the sounds, their German tongues wrestling with unfamiliar rhythms, but Mrs. Patterson only smiled and corrected gently. Margaret discovered she had an aptitude for languages. The patterns emerged quickly, the grammar revealing itself like a puzzle solved. Within weeks, she was reading simple English texts, then more complex ones. Mrs. Patterson loaned her a dictionary, and Margaret spent her evenings looking up words, writing them in her notebook, committing them to memory. One afternoon, Mrs. Patterson asked her to stay after class. Margaret's heart raced, expecting punishment for some infraction she couldn't name. But Mrs. Patterson only poured 2 cups of tea and sat across from her at the wooden table. "You're learning quickly," Mrs. Patterson said. "Have you thought about what you'll do after the war?" "Go home," Margaret said automatically. "Return to Germany." Mrs. Patterson's expression was unreadable. "And what will you do there?" "Germany will need rebuilding, but it will also need people who understand the wider world." The comment hung in the air. Margaret didn't respond, couldn't respond. The idea that there might be a choice, that the future might hold more than one path, it was too large to grasp. Christmas arrived with unexpected ceremony. The Americans decorated the mess hall with pine boughs and strings of popcorn. A tree appeared in the corner, lights twinkling like captured stars. On Christmas Eve, the camp chaplain, a soft-spoken man with kind eyes, held a service that welcomed prisoners and guards alike. He spoke of peace, of reconciliation, of the possibility of redemption even in the darkest times. And then came the gifts. Each prisoner received a small package, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Inside Margaret's, a bar of soap, a small box of chocolates, a knitted scarf in dark blue wool, and a card hand-signed by someone named Mrs. Henderson from the Raleigh Methodist Women's Circle. "We pray for your safe return home," the card read in careful handwriting. "May God bless you." Margaret sat on her bunk, holding the scarf, running the soft wool through her fingers. Someone in North Carolina, someone she would never meet, had spent hours knitting this for her. A German prisoner, an enemy, someone who deserved nothing. The thought cracked something inside her chest. She wore the scarf every day after that, even when it was too warm, as though it were armor against the erosion of everything she'd once believed. By February 1944, the camp had settled into a strange normality. The women worked, attended classes, borrowed books from the library. They played cards in the evenings, taught each other skills, knitting, English, cooking American recipes, with smuggled ingredients from the kitchen. They sang German songs softly in the barracks after lights out. Voices rising in harmony, and sometimes an American guard would pause outside listening. But beneath the routine, tensions simmered. Not all the women adapted. Some clung fiercely to their identity as soldiers of the Reich, refusing to learn English, refusing to cooperate beyond the minimum required. They whispered about betrayal, about those who'd grown too comfortable, too friendly with the Americans. They called Margaret a collaborator when she helped translate announcements, their eyes hard with judgment. One night, a woman named Gertrude Miller confronted her in the barracks. Gertrude was 41 years old, a former administrator from Berlin, her face etched with lines of hardship and unwavering conviction. "You shame us," Gertrude hissed, smiling at the guards, learning their language, accepting their gifts. "Have you forgotten who we are?" Margaret looked up from the book she was reading, an English grammar text. "I haven't forgotten, but neither have I forgotten that they could have treated us like animals and chose not to. They are the enemy. Then why are they feeding us better than our own government ever did?" The question silenced Gertrude, but only for a moment. "You're weak, corrupted. When we return home, people like you will be remembered." Margaret closed her book. "When we return home, Gertrude, there may not be anyone left to remember." The words were cruel but true. Letters from Germany, when they came at all, painted a picture of total collapse. Cities in ruins, families scattered, starvation everywhere. The few women who received mail read their letters aloud in hushed voices, and each one reinforced the same terrible reality. There was nothing to go back to. Yet the promise of repatriation loomed. The war was entering its final phase. Everyone knew Germany was losing, that surrender was inevitable. And when that happened, the prisoners would be sent home. The question that no one dared ask aloud was simple: did they want to go? Margaret wrestled with it nightly. Her family was gone. Her home was rubble. Everything she'd known had been destroyed. But staying in America meant betraying Germany, meant choosing comfort over loyalty, meant admitting that the enemy had shown her more humanity than her own nation. The choice felt impossible. In March, the camp commander, Colonel James Hartwell, called a general assembly. The women gathered in the mess hall, anxiety crackling through the air like static. Hartwell was a tall man, gray-haired and stern, but his voice when he spoke was measured. "Ladies, the end of the war in Europe is approaching. Plans are being made for your repatriation. However, I want to be clear about something." He paused, scanning the room. "You will be treated fairly throughout this process. Your health will be monitored. Your concerns will be heard. You are prisoners of war, but you are also human beings, and you will be treated as such until the moment you leave American soil." The statement should have been reassuring. Instead, it landed like a sentence: treated fairly until you leave. The implication was clear. This generosity, this abundance, this strange American mercy, it had an expiration date. That night, Margaret lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Around her, women shifted restlessly, their dreams troubled. Outside, a March wind rattled the windows, carrying the scent of pine and approaching spring. She thought about the bacon she'd eaten that first night, the soap that had restored her dignity, the books that had reopened her mind, the scarf knitted by a stranger's hands, the English words that now flowed more easily from her tongue, the American faces that had become familiar: Dorothy in the laundry, Mrs. Patterson in the classroom, even Colonel Hartwell with his strict fairness. She thought about Germany, about the ruins waiting for her, about the hunger and chaos and the ash of everything she'd once believed in. And she thought about a question that terrified her precisely because it had an answer. If given the choice, would she choose to stay? The answer was yes, and that realization kept her awake until dawn. May 8, 1945, VE Day. The announcement crackled over the camp loudspeakers at 2 in the afternoon. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. In the guard quarters, cheers erupted, soldiers whooping and embracing, the tension of years releasing in a single explosive moment of relief. But in the women's barracks, the reaction was different. Silence. Margaret stood by her bunk, hands clutching the rough wool blanket, and felt the world tilt. Over. The war was over. Germany had lost. The Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years had collapsed in 12. Everything her nation had promised, every sacrifice demanded, every life shattered, all of it for nothing. Around her, women wept, some from relief, others from grief. A few stood stoic, faces blank as stone. Ilse Becker sank onto her bunk and covered her face with her hands, shoulders shaking. Anna Schmidt stared out the window, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. Margaret felt numb. She'd known this was coming. Everyone had known. But the finality of it, The official confirmation that the world they left behind had ceased to exist, hit with a force she hadn't anticipated. An American officer appeared in the doorway, clipboard in hand. Major Eleanor Walsh. Her expression was carefully neutral. Ladies, in light of today's news, repatriation schedules will be accelerated. You should expect to leave within 60 to 90 days. Further details will be provided as arrangements are finalized. For now, please remain calm and follow normal routines. She left. The door closed, and the women were alone with the weight of what was coming. That evening, the mess hall was subdued. The usual chatter was absent, replaced by the clink of forks against plates and the occasional sniffle. The food was the same: chicken, potatoes, vegetables, bread, but it tasted like ashes in Margaret's mouth. She ate mechanically, forcing herself to swallow, and tried not to think about what lay ahead. After dinner, she walked to the library, seeking refuge in books. But when she arrived, she found she wasn't alone. A dozen other women had gathered, sitting on the floor, on chairs, on windowsills. They looked at each other with recognition, with a shared understanding of people facing the same impossible choice. Ilse spoke first, her voice hoarse. "What are we going home to?" No one answered. The question was rhetorical, but it demanded acknowledgement. "My husband is dead," Anna said quietly. "My children were evacuated east. I don't know where they are or if they're alive. My home is rubble. What am I returning to?" "Family," Gertrude said from the corner, her voice sharp. "Duty. Germany." "Germany doesn't exist anymore," someone else said. "Not the Germany we left." The conversation spiraled, voices overlapping, anger and fear and grief tangling together. Some women argued for return, insisting that Germany would need its people to rebuild, that to stay in America would be betrayal. Others countered that there was nothing to rebuild, that they would only be returning to starvation and chaos. Margaret listened, her mind churning. Finally, she spoke. "What if we asked to stay?" The room went silent. "Asked who?" Gertrude demanded. "The Americans. What if we formally requested permission to remain, at least temporarily, to work, to contribute, to—" she struggled for words, "to have time to decide what home even means now." "They'll refuse," Anna said. "The Geneva Convention requires repatriation. But the convention also allows for exceptions in cases of hardship," Ilse said slowly. "If we can prove that returning would place us in danger—" "We're Germans," Gertrude cut in. "We don't beg the enemy for favors." "Why not?" Margaret's voice rose. "They've fed us, educated us, treated us with more dignity than our own government ever did. If that makes them the enemy, then maybe our definition of enemy is wrong." Gertrude stood, her face flushed with anger. "You're a traitor, Hoffman. And when we return, when Germany rises from this defeat, people will remember what you said here." "If Germany rises," Margaret shot back, "it will be because people like us refuse to keep repeating the same lies that destroyed it in the first place." Gertrude stormed out. Several women followed her, but others remained, their faces thoughtful, troubled, open to the possibility that had just been named aloud. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lit a small candle, pulled out her notebook, and began to write. Not the careful observations she'd been recording, but a letter, a formal petition, to whom it may concern. "I am writing to request permission to remain in the United States beyond the scheduled repatriation date. My family is deceased, my home is destroyed. I have no means of support in Germany and no ability to contribute to rebuilding efforts without first regaining my own stability. I ask not for citizenship, but for the opportunity to work, to earn my keep, to prove myself worthy of the kindness that has been shown to me during my time in captivity. I am willing to accept any conditions, any restrictions, any supervision deemed necessary. I do not make this request lightly. I understand the implications. But I also understand that sometimes survival requires choosing an imperfect future over a non-existent past. Respectfully, Margaret Hoffman." She read it 3 times, then tucked it into her notebook. She didn't know if she would ever send it. The very act of writing it felt like crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. But the line was already behind her. She'd crossed it the first time she'd tasted bacon and let herself feel grateful. She'd crossed it when she learned English, when she accepted the scarf, when she'd smiled at Dorothy in the laundry. The choice had been made incrementally in 1,000 small betrayals that had added up to something she could no longer deny. She wanted to stay, and in the weeks to come, she would discover she wasn't alone. June 1945, Camp Butner. The summer heat arrived fierce and unrelenting, turning the barracks into ovens by midday. Fans whirred constantly, pushing hot air in circles, offering relief that was more psychological than practical. The women moved slowly, conserving energy, their cotton dresses sticking to damp skin. Outside, cicadas screamed their eternal song, and thunderstorms rolled through in the afternoons. Brief, violent downpours that left the air thick and steaming. Repatriation lists were posted weekly on the bulletin board outside the administration building. Women crowded around, searching for their names, reactions ranging from relief to despair. Some whose names appeared early packed their meager belongings with grim determination. Others, whose names were further down the list, moved through the days in a fog of anticipation and dread. Margaret's name had not yet appeared. She didn't know if that was mercy or torment. The petition she'd written remained hidden in her notebook. She'd shown it to Ilsa and Anna, both of whom had written their own versions. Together, they debated whether to actually submit them, whether such a request would be seen as ingratitude or desperation or treason. In the end, it was Ilsa who decided. "What's the worst they can do?" she asked one night in the barracks, her voice pitched low. "Say no? Send us home anyway? We lose nothing by asking." "Except dignity," Gertrude muttered from across the room. "I lost my dignity when I accepted their soap," Ilsa replied. "I lost it when I let them feed me. I lost it when I realized I was healthier as their prisoner than I'd been as a free woman in Germany. At this point, I'm just trying to survive." The next morning, Margaret, Ilsa, and Anna walked together to Colonel Hartwell's office. They'd coordinated their story, rehearsed their arguments. Major Walsh met them at the door, her expression unreadable. "Ladies, the colonel is busy. If this concerns repatriation schedules—" "It concerns a formal request, Major," Margaret said in careful English. She'd practiced the words until they felt natural. "We wish to petition for extended stay in the United States." Walsh's eyebrows rose. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she stepped aside. "Come in." Colonel Hartwell's office was Spartan. A desk, filing cabinets, maps on the walls marking troop movements that were now historic rather than current. The colonel himself sat behind the desk, reading a report. He looked up as they entered, his expression shifting from irritation to curiosity. "Major Walsh says you have a petition?" Margaret stepped forward. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed the 3 letters on his desk. "Sir, we are requesting permission to remain in the United States past repatriation. We have no families to return to. Our homes are destroyed. We believe we could contribute more to Germany's future by first establishing stability here, then potentially assisting with rebuilding efforts later." Hartwell picked up the letters, reading them in silence. His face gave nothing away. When he finished, he set them down and folded his hands on the desk. "This is highly irregular." "Yes, sir. The Geneva Convention mandates repatriation of all prisoners of war, with exceptions for humanitarian hardship, sir." Hartwell's eyes narrowed. "You've been reading the convention?" "The camp library has a copy, sir, in German." A smile flickered across his face. Gone so quickly, Margaret thought she might have imagined it. He leaned back in his chair, studying the 3 women. "I can't make this decision. It would require approval from the State Department, possibly the War Department. There would be interviews, background checks, conditions, and I'll be honest with you. The political climate is complicated right now. There's not a lot of sympathy for Germans, even women who were auxiliaries rather than soldiers." "We understand, sir." Ilsa's voice was steady. "We're asking for consideration, not promises." Hartwell was silent for a long moment. Then he picked up the letters again. "I'll forward these to the appropriate authorities. That's all I can do. Don't get your hopes up." "Thank you, sir." They left the office in a daze. Outside, the heat hit them like a physical force. They walked back to the barracks without speaking, each lost in thought. Word spread quickly. By evening, everyone in the camp knew that Margaret, Ilsa, and Anna had petitioned to stay. Reactions were swift and divided. Some women approached them quietly, asking for advice, admitting they'd been thinking the same thing. Within a week, 17 more petitions had been submitted. By the end of the month, the number had grown to 32, but others were less supportive. Gertrude and her faction began calling them traitors openly. They spat at Margaret when she passed in the yard. They refused to speak to Ilsa in the mess hall. They whispered that after the return, after Germany rebuilt, such betrayals would be remembered. The division in the camp grew toxic. Friendships fractured. Arguments erupted over trivial matters, masking deeper conflicts about identity, loyalty, and survival. The Americans watched with growing concern, increasing security patrols, breaking up altercations before they escalated. Major Walsh called Margaret into her office one afternoon. The major looked tired, dark circles under her eyes. "Miss Hoffman, I need you to understand something. Your petition has caused complications, not just here, but politically. There are people in Washington who see this as a propaganda opportunity, others who see it as a liability. Your case is being debated at levels far above my pay grade." "I didn't mean to cause trouble, Major." "I know, but trouble is what you've caused." Walsh sighed. "Off the record, I admire your courage. It takes guts to ask for what you want, especially from people you were taught to hate. But I can't promise you anything, and I need you to prepare for the possibility that the answer will be no." Margaret nodded. "I understand." "Do you? Because if you're forced to return, life in Germany won't be easy for someone known as a collaborator." The word hung in the air like smoke. Collaborator. It was kinder than traitor, but not by much. "I'll deal with that if it happens," Margaret said. July arrived with no word on the petitions. The repatriation ships began departing from New York, carrying hundreds of German prisoners back across the Atlantic. Each week, more women from Camp Butner were loaded onto buses and transported north to the ports. The barracks grew emptier, the mess hall quieter. Margaret watched them go. These women who'd shared her captivity and felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief that she wasn't going yet, guilt for that relief, fear that her turn was coming, and beneath it all, a stubborn, irrational hope that maybe, just maybe, someone in Washington would see reason. She continued working in the laundry, continued studying English, continued borrowing books from the library. She'd moved beyond grammar texts to novels, Steinbeck, Hemingway, Fitzgerald, absorbing not just language but worldview, the distinctly American philosophy that seemed to value individualism and possibility over tradition and fate. Mrs. Patterson loaned her a copy of The Great Gatsby, and Margaret read it twice, fascinated by the tragedy of a man who reinvented himself only to be destroyed by the past he couldn't escape. She wondered if that was her story too, if the past would drag her back no matter how hard she fought against it. One August evening, as thunderheads built on the horizon and lightning flickered in the distance, Major Walsh appeared at the barracks door. "Hoffman, Becker, Schmidt, come with me." They followed her to the administration building, rain beginning to fall in fat drops that exploded against the dusty ground. Walsh led them into a conference room where Colonel Hartwell waited, along with a man in civilian clothes Margaret didn't recognize. Hartwell gestured to chairs. They sat, back straight, hands folded in laps, trying to read the situation from expressions that revealed nothing. The civilian spoke first. His voice was crisp, northeastern. "My name is Mr. Aldrich. I'm with the State Department. I've reviewed your petitions, along with 31 others from this camp and similar requests from camps in Wisconsin, Texas, and Georgia. What you've asked for is unprecedented." Margaret's heart sank. Unprecedented meant impossible. But Aldrich continued. "However, that doesn't mean it's without precedent. There are mechanisms within immigration law for hardship cases, and frankly, the optics of forcing women with no families and no homes back into a devastated Germany are problematic." A spark of something Margaret didn't dare name flickered in her chest. "Here's what's being proposed," Aldrich said. "A pilot program. 25 German female prisoners from various camps will be granted temporary resident status, not citizenship, not permanent residency. Temporary status, renewable annually, contingent on employment, good behavior, and regular check-ins with authorities. You'll be essentially on parole for at least 5 years. Maybe longer, Ilsa gasped. Anna's hand flew to her mouth. Margaret sat frozen, not trusting herself to speak. The selection criteria are strict, Aldrich went on. No one with direct combat experience, no one with Nazi Party affiliations, no one with criminal records or security concerns. You three have been cleared. If you accept these terms, you'll be among the first. Accept? Margaret's voice cracked. You're saying we can stay? I'm saying you can apply to stay. There will be interviews, background investigations, medical examinations, psychological evaluations. The process will take months, and there are conditions. You'll need employment, sponsors, regular reports. If you violate any terms, you'll be deported immediately. Understood? Yes. The word burst from all three of them simultaneously. Aldrich allowed himself a small smile. Then we'll begin the process tomorrow. Colonel Hartwell will coordinate. After they left the room, the three women stood in the rain, too stunned to move. The storm had arrived fully now, water pouring from the sky. But they didn't run for cover. They stood there getting soaked, looking at each other with expressions that mixed disbelief and joy and terror. We're staying, Anna whispered. We're actually staying. Maybe, Ilsa cautioned. We still have to pass the evaluations. We'll pass, Margaret said with a certainty she didn't entirely feel. We have to. That night she wrote in her notebook by candlelight, rain drumming on the roof, thunder rolling across the North Carolina hills. Today I was given permission to stay in the land of my enemies. Tomorrow I begin the process of becoming something I don't yet have a name for. Not German, not American. Something in between. Something new. I don't know if this is redemption or cowardice. I don't know if I'm running from something or towards something. All I know is that when they offered me the choice between home and here, between memory and possibility, I chose possibility. And that choice, more than any battle, has made me feel like a soldier in a war I'm only beginning to understand. She closed the notebook and blew out the candle. Outside, the storm raged on. But inside the barracks, in the darkness, Margaret smiled. For the first time since crossing the Atlantic, she had something resembling hope. And hope, she was learning, was the most dangerous, wonderful thing you could carry. November 1945, Camp Butner. The repatriation had ground to a near halt. Most of the German prisoners had been shipped home by September, the camp population dwindling to a fraction of what it had been at peak. The remaining women were mostly those in the pilot program, awaiting final clearances, undergoing interviews, existing in limbo between prisoner and resident. The camp itself felt ghostly now. Entire barracks stood empty, windows dark, doors sealed. The mess hall served maybe 40 people where it once fed 300. The library had been packed up and donated, the classroom closed. Even the guard presence had diminished, skeleton crews maintaining security out of bureaucratic necessity rather than actual threat. Margaret had been through 5 rounds of interviews, each more invasive than the last. They asked about her family, her service, her beliefs. They showed her photographs of Nazi rallies and asked if she'd attended. They questioned her about propaganda she'd heard, actions she'd witnessed, decisions she'd made. The interrogators were polite but relentless, probing for any hint of ideology that might disqualify her. She answered honestly mostly. Yes, she'd believed the propaganda at first. Yes, she'd thought the war was justified. Yes, she'd done her job without questioning orders. But she also told them about the collapse of those beliefs, about the bacon and soap and books, about the moment she'd realized the enemy wasn't what she'd been taught. They took notes. They conferred in corners. They asked her to wait outside while they discussed her case. The hardest interview came from a psychologist, Dr. Weiss, a German Jewish émigré who'd fled Berlin in 1938. He spoke to her in German, his accent carrying the weight of loss. Tell me, Fräulein Hoffmann, why you want to stay. She'd prepared for this question, rehearsed the answer. But sitting across from this man whose people her nation had tried to exterminate, the rehearsed words died in her throat. I don't have anywhere else to go, she said finally. But that's not the whole truth. The truth is, America treated me better than Germany ever did. And I'm ashamed that it took becoming a prisoner to learn what dignity feels like. Dr. Weiss studied her for a long moment. Then he wrote something in his notes and closed the folder. Thank you for your honesty. She didn't know if she'd passed or failed. By late November, the decision started coming through. Anna Schmidt was approved with the condition that she work as a nurse's aide at Duke Hospital in Durham and report weekly to a parole officer. Ilsa Becker was approved with placement as a housekeeper for a family in Raleigh. Both would be released from Camp Butner in December, given civilian clothes, identity papers stamped with temporary resident, enemy alien, and bus fare to their destinations. Margaret's approval came on Thanksgiving Day. Major Walsh delivered the news personally, finding Margaret in the near-empty library where she'd been reading Walden in English. "Congratulations, Miss Hoffman. You've been cleared. You'll be released on December 15th. Margaret looked up from the book, heart pounding. "Where will I go?" "You've been placed with a family in Charlotte, the Hendersons. They need a housekeeper and we're willing to sponsor a refugee. You'll live in their home, work for room and board plus a small salary, and report monthly to authorities. The terms are outlined here." She handed over a manila folder thick with papers. Margaret took it with trembling hands. "Thank you, Major." Walsh's expression softened slightly. "I hope this works out for you. I really do. But understand, you'll be watched closely. Any misstep, any violation, and you're on the next ship to Germany. The political climate is delicate. There are people who think this program is a mistake. I understand. Do you?" Walsh leaned against the bookshelf. "Miss Hoffman, you're about to enter a country that just fought a brutal war against your homeland. You'll face hostility, suspicion, possibly violence. You'll be neither German nor American, trusted by neither. It won't be easy. It will be easier than going home to nothing." Walsh nodded slowly. "Perhaps. Well, good luck." The final weeks at Camp Butner were strange. Margaret and the other approved women existed in a state of surreal anticipation. They were no longer quite prisoners, but not yet free. They moved through the routines, roll call, work assignments, meals, but everything felt provisional, temporary, already fading into memory. On December 1st, a Red Cross worker brought them clothes, not prison uniforms, but civilian dresses, coats, shoes. The women tried them on in the barracks, turning before makeshift mirrors, hardly recognizing themselves. Margaret's dress was dark blue wool, conservative and plain, with a matching coat and sensible low-heeled shoes. She looked at herself and saw a stranger, not a soldier, not a prisoner, just a woman. Gertrude and the handful of women who'd refused to petition watched the preparations with barely concealed contempt. On one of the last nights, Gertrude cornered Margaret outside the latrine. "You think you're escaping," Gertrude said, her voice low and venomous. "But you're not. You're running away. And one day when Germany recovers, and it will recover, you'll be remembered as a coward and a traitor." Margaret met her gaze steadily. "Then remember me as that. But remember also that I survived, and that I made a choice when there were no good choices. You're welcome to judge me, Gertrude, but you'll be doing it from the ruins while I'm doing it from here." Gertrude spat at her feet and walked away. December 15th dawned cold and clear. Margaret woke before the bell, too nervous to sleep. She dressed in her new civilian clothes, packed her few belongings in a small suitcase provided by the Red Cross. Her notebook, the photo of her family, the book she'd been gifted, the blue scarf from Mrs. Henderson's church circle. At 9 a.m., she stood with Anna and Ilsa outside the administration building, waiting for the bus that would take them to the train station. Colonel Hartwell came out to see them off, which surprised her. "Ladies," he said, shaking each of their hands, "you're about to embark on a difficult journey. I hope you find what you're looking for. And I hope you remember that the America that offered you this chance is not perfect. But it tries. That's worth something." "It's worth everything, sir," Margaret said. The bus arrived. They climbed aboard, taking seats near the back. As Camp Butner receded through the rear window, the barracks, the guard towers, the wire fence that had defined their lives for over 2 years, Margaret felt an unexpected surge of emotion. She was leaving captivity, but she was also leaving the only stability she'd known since the war began. The train station in Raleigh was crowded with civilians, their faces and voices a cacophony of normalcy. Margaret and the others drew stares. Women in new clothes, but with something indefinably foreign about them. Their posture, their way of moving, the wariness in their eyes. They said goodbye on the platform. Anna heading to Durham, Ilsa staying in Raleigh, Margaret continuing south to Charlotte. They embraced these women who'd shared the impossible journey from enemies to refugees and promised to write, to stay in touch, to support each other through whatever came next. "We're pioneers," Ilsa said, trying to smile through tears. "The first Germans to choose America over Germany." "Let's hope we're not the last," Anna replied. Margaret boarded her train alone, found a seat by the window, watched North Carolina countryside roll past. Pine forests, small towns, red clay roads. The train was warm, the seats comfortable. A conductor came through offering newspapers. Coffee. She bought coffee, sipping it slowly, savoring the bitter warmth, and opened the newspaper. The headline stopped her cold. "German war brides face hostility in American communities." She read the article, her stomach nodding. It described German women who'd married American soldiers during the occupation, then immigrated to the United States. Many faced harassment, vandalism, threats. Communities that had lost sons to the war weren't eager to welcome German women, regardless of circumstances. Margaret folded the newspaper and stared out the window. She was walking into that same hostility, without even the protection of marriage to an American soldier. Just herself, her status as former enemy, and a precarious permission to exist. The train pulled into Charlotte in the late afternoon. Margaret disembarked, clutching her suitcase, and looked around the bustling station. People hurried past, focused on their own destinations, paying her no attention. She felt invisible and conspicuous all at once. A man in his 50s approached, wearing a suit and carrying a sign that read, "Hoffman." He had a kind face, gray hair, and tired eyes. "Miss Hoffman, I'm Robert Henderson. My wife and I are your sponsors." She shook his hand, her English suddenly feeling inadequate. "Thank you for this opportunity, Mr. Henderson. We'll do our best to make you comfortable. It's a big adjustment for everyone. Let's get you home." Home. The word felt strange, hollow, but she followed him to a car, an actual private automobile, another reminder of American abundance, and climbed into the passenger seat. As they drove through Charlotte, Margaret stared at the city. Streetlights coming on in the gathering dusk, shops decorated for Christmas, people carrying packages, smiling, living lives untouched by the war that had consumed her world. It was beautiful and heartbreaking all at once. The Henderson house was in a quiet neighborhood, a modest two-story home with a small yard and a porch. Mrs. Henderson met them at the door, a plump woman in her 50s with gray-streaked, brown hair and a warm but wary smile. "Welcome, dear. I'm Martha. Come in, come in. You must be exhausted." The house was warm, smelling of cooking meat and pine from a Christmas tree in the corner. Margaret stood in the entryway, overwhelmed by the normality of it. A home, an actual home with family photographs on the walls, and a cat sleeping on the sofa, and children's toys scattered on the floor. "We have 3 children," Martha explained, leading her upstairs. 2 boys and a girl, all married and moved out now. Your room is the old nursery. It's small, but it's private." The room was indeed small, a narrow bed, a dresser, a single window overlooking the backyard, but it was clean and quiet and hers. Margaret set down her suitcase and turned to Mrs. Henderson. "Thank you for taking this risk." Martha's expression complicated. "I won't lie to you, Miss Hoffman. I have reservations. My nephew died at Normandy. My brother-in-law was wounded in the Bulge. When Robert suggested sponsoring a German prisoner, I nearly refused, but our pastor convinced me that Christian charity demands we help even our enemies." The words stung, but Margaret appreciated the honesty. "I understand. I will work hard. I will cause no trouble, and I will be grateful every day for this chance." "See that you do." Martha's tone softened slightly. "Supper is at 6. We'll discuss your duties tomorrow. For tonight, rest." After Martha left, Margaret sat on the bed and looked around her new room. She pulled out her notebook and wrote, "December 15, 1945. I am in America, not as a prisoner, not quite as a resident. Something in between. The Hendersons are kind but guarded. They see me as an enemy they've been commanded to help. I will have to earn their trust one day at a time. I don't know what I am anymore. Not German. Germany cast me out when I chose to stay. Not American. America has only provisionally accepted me. I exist in limbo, defined by what I'm not rather than what I am. But I have a room. I have a chance. And somewhere in this strange land, there might be a future. She closed the notebook and lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. Through the walls, she could hear the murmur of the Hendersons talking, the clatter of dishes, the ordinary sounds of domestic life. Outside, Christmas lights twinkled on neighboring houses. Margaret had survived the war. She'd survived captivity. Now came the hardest part, surviving peace, surviving freedom, surviving the choice she'd made. And as she drifted toward sleep, exhausted and uncertain and alive, one thought circled through her mind. They'd told her to go home, but home had ceased to exist. So she'd chosen to build a new one in the land of her enemies. Now she had to learn how to live with that choice and hope that someday it would feel like less of a betrayal